So thank you very much. It's nice to see you all. A few old friends. This is a fun visit because I'm meeting a few people that I haven't seen in, after a while you say decades, not years anymore. In a few decades. Um, and it is the first time I've actually been able to be here in person, even though it's been great fun to support the IDG process by looking at my little bit of plastic and metal, right? So it's really nice to be here. And I really wanted to do this so that I could get more of a feeling of how it's progressing. The question that Katrin asked me to reflect on, or somebody who wrote this up, but we talked about it for a few minutes. What do we need to pay attention to in building the IDG initiative? I think it's a great question. I have no answer, of course, whatsoever. But it's a good question for all of us. I did appreciate the comments on dialogue, and were a very important part of my personal and our collective development for a long, long time, going back to a very important mentor named David Bohm, who I had the good pleasure to get to meet a few years before he passed away. He had the kindness to review the early drafts that we were trying to write on dialogue for the fifth discipline. And it's one of those areas that is probably a good illustration of our predicament. In one sense, it's deeply inherent in us. I think it was Goethe who called conversation the most sublime of human experiences. And of course, understanding that the root of conversation, conversare in Latin, literally means turning together. It's not about words. It's this kind of collective movement. And in some sense, one of the reasons dialogue is so interesting is that it is a somatic phenomenon. I remember years ago watching a researcher who'd done nothing more than set up a camera in I think it was either a doctor's office or maybe probably a therapist's office. People having conversations. And then he studied it at about 5 times normal speed. And literally you could watch the bodies synchronize. And of course, people weren't thinking about this at all. But you could tell, they would go from here to here. And then all of a sudden, when the conversation deepened, literally the bodies moved in a beautiful kind of dance. David used to call it the holo movement. Of course, David was a physicist, so he was entitled to create these kind of terms. But ever since then, I thought one of the most interesting practices, this is a good gathering to do it, which is you just kind of imagine it's all one movement. Imagine everything going on in this room right now is one movement. And of course, we tend to see it from this vantage point, or we look at a person, or we look at a presenter, but we do have peripheral as well as focused vision. And the peripheral vision is always there. We're just not paying attention to it a lot. That condition in our kind of evolution of our work, of the dialogue conditions, that has always seemed to me the one that's kind of easiest to miss, because it is just exactly what we don't tend to pay attention to. What I'm referring to is the safe space. But we tend to pay attention to it at the emotional level because, of course, we're very aware. When we're in a setting where we're not safe, where we're not relaxed, of course, whether or not we're thinking about it or not, our body knows, right? It's right here, it's right here. There's that feeling of not quite being at ease. But in fact, it's really one of the cornerstones of all traditional cultures. You never start a meeting with the meeting. You always have some sort of ceremonial way, something we've pretty much lost in modern society. But, I've had a chance, of course, to be part of this sort of thing many, many times in the North American native or Indian traditions. And you'll always start with some form of smudging with the smoke, prayers. And of course, that's an example of what happens in all traditional cultures, basically, that I've ever been around, which is you don't just start the work until you pay attention to the space, not just the experience safety for the individual, but literally the space. This space, physically, interpersonally, David would even say collectively in a very particular way, is really where it all starts. And the gestures, the simple gestures, this is what ceremony is all about. Simple collective gestures of honoring our gratitude for being here, the possibility of what's here, and of course, all those without whom we wouldn't have been here. So almost all traditional cultures will start off with thanking ancestors, people who, in our materialistic view, aren't here, but in their view are very much here, because they're in the trees and they're in the water, and they're literally in the space, and can be invoked in lots of different ways. To me, they're just simple illustrations of our predicament. In the simplest way I can express it is all of this is quite innate in us. I don't think as a social species we would have made it too far had we not cultivated these capacities. But of course, it's such a far distance from where we live and work and act today in the modern society that it can seem almost romantic. For most of us, silence is the absence of words. But for traditional cultures, silence is the presence of something. And until that something is present, you can't really do much that's very useful. So I appreciate it. There was a line you said right at the beginning. If you don't mind me, I think I got it down right. You never took the time to clear out your mind. See, and you won't take the time to clear out your mind if you think silence is just the absence of talking, because we're way too busy rehearsing what we might say, as opposed to, no, part of my ceremonial preparation for entering anything is to just notice whatever's going on and do my best to just let it go. There's an old saying, I've spent a lot of time in China. I had a good fortune to have a teacher in China. And whenever people are starting some sort of serious contemplative meditative practice, they always say, I have so many thoughts, I have so many thoughts. And of course, they have thoughts and emotions. David used to often say, we really shouldn't just have a word for thought and emotion that are separate, because there's no thought without an emotion, there's no emotion without a thought. He literally liked the word felt. So I felt it, and I thought it, and I felt it. Anyhow, so my Chinese teacher used to always say, the thoughts that you're trying to get rid of is pointless. Don't try to get rid of your thoughts. It's sort of like if you have relatives who've come to visit and they've stayed too long. The more attention you give them, the more likely they are to continue staying. Once you ignore them, after a while, they go. So it is the natural flow of our awareness that thoughts and emotions rise and then fall. And the irony of all that, which is again so simple, is it takes a lot of time and commitment. So these are things, the question, what to pay attention to. The two things that are kind of simplest in my mind is, like I'm trying to illustrate right now, to start to attend to that which we know innately is important, but we're not habituated, trained, or used to doing it. Like the gratitude for just being here and the quality of this space physically and interpersonally and socially. We don't have a good word for that, but like the phenomenon of the space beyond the physical. And focus on practice. If you want to see a great YouTube video, and I think you can find it by Googling this. How many of you ever watched the little, I think he's about 10 years old, maybe he's 8 years old, Indian kid with his YouTube video on what you practice. Anybody ever seen that? I'll check it out. I'm pretty sure if you Google what you practice, you'll get it. And I have no idea where he is. It's the internet. He's somewhere. He could be in India. He could be in Chicago. I don't know. But his YouTube is just brilliant. He says, what you practice, you'll get good at. You want to hear it again? What you practice, you'll get good at. If you practice being grouchy, you'll get very, very good at being grouchy. If you practice complaining, you'll get very, very good at complaining. And he gives lots of great examples. And then he ends up by saying, so I recommend you practice joy. So the word practice in English is one of the many kind of neat English words, which English is a very ambiguous language, thank God. Otherwise, there'd be no poetry. So there's a law of practice, right? So that's a practice. there is the spirit of this comment of what you practice is just in terms of what you do. And then there's the notion practice like things you work at. You know, like if you want to be a musician, you will practice scales or whatever, right? So that's a little different meaning of the word practice too. So particularly in our work, and I would say in this work, the danger is these are good ideas that we all know are needed. And at some level, they're very intrinsic or familiar to us. That's really important because they're not arcane, they're not esoteric. But the real question is, how do we practice them? What does it mean to do or practice being? I know it's a little bit of an odd phrase in English. But if it isn't, there's no capacity to develop. As far as I can see, the reason practice, the way I'm using it now, is so important is that that is literally how we consciously develop. We practice something. So
please give it up for Peter Senge. Thank you so much, Peter. And I think a lot of us are looking forward to actually practicing with you for the next 3 days as well. We do have a bit more time with you, so we are thinking to actually opening up also for some questions here, and we're also trying to cover if there is any questions from the online audience. So let's see what's coming in. Maybe first question from my side, and also we gathered some of the questions that you sent us before. So let's see how many we can cover. I just have a look at the time as well. Since you just said that we need to pay attention to the space, what are you sensing in the space here?
Well, obviously, this is a question that can only be answered personally. And it's not a matter of subjective or objective. It's just, you know, what do you experience? So what I'm saying now may or may not be representative for anyone else. I sense some anxiety. In also a positive sense, you know, when you're trying to do something, you're not sure how it's going to work. There's a kind of anxiety which is really quite positive, but also that's fear too. You know, and this is the words that I would kind of put around that feeling. Is it one more effort to turn a ship that can't be turned? Is it really for everybody or somebody or a few people? What does it mean to have an inner development goal? I'm not sure that question has ever been pondered a lot. But, you know, in most developmental traditions I know, goals are actually problematic. You know, your development at a deeper levels is more a gift. And what is Frost's line? That you should not have needed to deserve. There's a common notion in many developmental or spiritual traditions of a kind of original nature or kind of who we actually are, different ways to express this idea. But striving to become who you actually are actually tends to move you in the opposite direction. And when you think about these things, you realize, well, first kind of principle of development is profoundly paradoxical. But without an intent, nothing much is probably going to happen. But striving to listen, well, notice the state the body gets in as soon as you strive to listen. The contractedness, the tension. You're probably not too good at listening when you're in that state. So anyhow, yeah, it's a complex territory.
Yeah, thank you for the personal reflections there on the space as well. I'm looking into the crowd as I do see a first hand coming up, and we have a mic, and then I'll also try to position myself a bit here so I can check the chat. Maybe we just switch place and I'll let you be here so I can also have a bit of an eye on the online audience. Please, Fontes, go ahead.
Yes. So, Peter, great to meet you here again. Yeah, this is maybe a little bit related to what you were just referring to. I mean, I really like the idea of the inner development goals. I I agree with you with the challenge of striving towards a goal. So how do we make use of this framework and ensure that we're not just doing more of the same,
Yeah.
strengthening the old, but actually contributing to a transition to something that is more regenerative and thriving?
Yeah. That's the question we kind of all have, right? Um, the word that came up to my mind when I just was sitting with your question was vulnerability. And maybe this is kind of why this question, what does it mean to have an inner development goal, emerged to me as kind of an interesting question. Because openness, no openness, no listening, since listening is a theme here. What does openness mean? Well, it means I don't know and I'm not capable. I mean, if I was capable, why do I need to be open to you? So it is innately a state of vulnerability. It's not easy. This is easy to say, but every one of us, myself included, can give example after example where the last thing I'm inclined to do in a certain situation is be vulnerable. I think really embracing not knowing. We have no clue if this will make any difference at all. And really sitting with that. It's not that we don't care. It's not that we don't have intention. So please don't mishear my little question about goals. Intentionality is so fundamental to being a human. But to have intention without, and know that you just don't know.
Thank you. Do we have another question in the audience? I'm also looking at the online. There are some questions coming in. One that we received before, since I think what you just said, this kind of embracing the not knowing is something that is quite tough for all of us, but as you said, quite important. One of the biggest challenges is also to really, one of the biggest ambitions is to connect inner development with sustainability in this initiative.
Right.
And that was also one of the questions that we received beforehand. How do you see this pathway between inner development and sustainability, how to really connect that?
Well, I don't think there's two things. I think it's just the same thing. So, I know this is probably drive some of you nuts. What the hell does inner mean anyhow? Really? Would you show me the inner? No, we're humans. We have experience, which includes thoughts and feelings and whatever else is going on, like right now. Can you find the inner in that? No, you have experience. So, to me, and I'm not arguing with the terminology for a pragmatic reason. I'm making a little different point right now. Since so much of our attention in the world is on all the stuff out there, one of our fundamental challenges is this whole culture over, who knows, you could say at least 500 years, probably more like 1,500 years, has drifted more and more to a materialistic orientation. I'm trained as a scientist and engineer, but I will say, of course, for most scientists, what's most real is what's measurable. It's almost a definition, scientific definition of that's to focus on the outer or external or manifest, whatever word you want. In that context, I can understand how focusing on the inner is a kind of gesture, a serious gesture of rebalancing. That said, it basically says our strategy is based on what we're trying to oppose. Right? There's been so much attention on the outer, we're trying to counter that. That's fine. I think practically that might turn out to be very useful. But it's also useful to recognize we don't know what the fuck we're talking about when we say inner. Really, I mean, what the heck does it really mean? Except to contrast with a focus on the outer. So if you go that far, then you say, well, what does outer really mean? These are the real questions, I think, and I'm not saying this for everyone, I think one of the aims of this whole effort is to make something more and more accessible, not obscure, not esoteric. One of the problems, and this is not accidental, historically for all kinds of good reasons, many of the most important developmental traditions are very esoteric. They were meant to be taken out of the mainstream. Certainly here in the West, where all the real developmental traditions of in the Christian tradition were consciously made esoteric. So there were plenty of advanced cultivators. I heard a really hilarious story once from the teacher I had in China of there were a lot of Christian monks who traveled to China in the 6th, 7th century or so. There was a particular time period. In fact, there was a big Christian movement in China in the early Tang dynasty. So that's like from 700 AD. For about 100 years. They built Christian churches all over because there were so many monks coming. And he said many of them were very advanced cultivators. That was the jargon term the Chinese were using. Several of them were quite good at levitation. They had all kinds of capacities. That was never mainstream. It was meant to be esoteric, to keep that body of knowledge away from the public, so to speak. Yeah, you could say it was part of the political strategy of the church and all that. Probably was. Nonetheless, so this is the background against which we're operating. In the Western tradition, this fragmentation of, I'll use the language now, the inner and the outer, the mundane and the spiritual, the manifest and the infinite. You can use a lot of languages. The first principle of in my experience of most of the more profound, accessible developmental disciplines is there is no separation. The manifest only exists because of the infinite, and the infinite only exists because of the manifest. There is no inner and outer. There is only that. So that's more esoteric. So I think that's a challenge. We know that'll tend to be exclusive. You hear again the dilemmas. So on the other hand, I do think there's a role for leadership. And what I mean now is a very particular way. Groups of people and organizations who are really ready for the deeper, more, I'll call it traditionally esoteric ways of thinking about this. Not to be separate or better, but just because, the deepening of all this is not trivial. Silence is not just the absence of words. Here? There's something there. That doesn't mean that's readily accessible for a lot of people, at least in the short term. So both are important. I really appreciate. I think the way the IDGs have been synthesized. In this day and age, whether we like it or not, if science says it's scientific, guess what? Science is the church of this era. If the scientists say it, it's more real. Being one, I can say that ain't really true. It's a very social process. It's very, very not black and white. That said, it is useful to be able to say, we've done through all this process to get some scientific consensus around these areas. That helps people. It actually is part of creating a safe space, ironically. So I do think all that's very important. And so too is doing the best we can do to recognize that human beings have been at this journey of development for tens of thousands of years. There's no shortage of deep knowledge.
Since you've challenged goals and you've challenged inner, do you want to challenge development as well?
Sure. I can challenge most anything. Well, again, back to why setting goals for inner development is tricky. So the simplest way I can kind of articulate this view, this is just a point of view. None of this is true, right? It's just a point of view. Just like science, it's just a point of view that you've made an effort to understand. If you start with a premise, like there is something like inner nature, or original nature, or true nature, or an aspect of us which we didn't do anything to achieve, it comes with the territory. It's part of what it means to be a human being. And it's natural in life, and particularly so in this cultural epoch, to drift very far away from that. As I said, and striving to get back to it might actually be exactly the opposite. A common teacher, looking at Joran there, that we all share, always says, and he's studied many, many Senge traditions. Relaxation and presence, the two recurring principles of real development.
I'm taking one question from the audience before we are going to have to finish this off. So we have Evelyn Oberleitner who asks, how does the power of organizations differ from the power of an individual?
How organizations.
How does the power of an organization differ from the power of an individual?
Well, I mean, probably the phrase itself evokes a lot to all of us. It clearly does. And here's another way to me to characterize our predicament right now. Most of the, and I'll use the term developmental traditions now, so in the same spirit in which I was just talking about, are individualistic, that we have access to. Yes, there are some, the Sufi tradition would be a good example, where there clearly were a lot of collective cultivation practices. There are some of those, but by and large, most, East and West, are quite individual. Yet the predicaments we face were not created by individuals, right? None of us could eradicate a species no matter how hard we tried, right? Collectively, we do a perfectly fair, perfectly good job at it. So that fundamental distinction between the developmental traditions we have access to naturally are more individual. And the problems are not created at the individual level. The problems, the causality is somehow collective. That's a really deep issue. And I think institutions kind of sit there right in the middle because they're an agent of collectives. So how we kind of build those communities of individuals, which will always be individuals at some level, embedded in different institutions as a representative or a way of accessing the collective agency that shapes the problems is important. So yes, institutions have power. But well, you won't like this, but what the hell is an institution anyhow?
What a great closing word. Thank you so much, Peter. I'm looking forward to a lot of more challenges in the next 3 days.
Forward to seeing you. Thank you.
Thank you. Please give it up for Peter Senge. So, let's now, from all